I think we can all agree on the kind of centrality of the values of sovereignty, non-intervention and protection of human rights. I don't think there's any disagreement there. I think it's much more about how do we implement or create or revise or reform a system that will really protect those values.
Hello and welcome to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives dedicated to advancing the conversation on multilateralism. And today we have Professor Alanna O'Malley, who is Chair of Global Governance and Wealth and Head of Department at the School of History, Culture and Communication at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. She is a historian of international relations. She's an expert on the United Nations, decolonization and the Global South. And she is no stranger to the Library and Archives, and was here only last year at the same time, talking to us also about invisible histories and a new project that she was starting. So you've showed how Global South actors have not only used but fundamentally shaped the UN, often in ways that our mainstream histories overlook. And today I wanted to take that conversation a little bit forward and ask really things around what does the invisible history tell us about multilateralism now and what it could become. You know, following the discussion that we had at this rather special seminar this week in Geneva.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me back to the podcast. And it's always such a pleasure to be here in Geneva and at the Palais with all the wonderful archivists and librarians at the UN Library. And so, so we had this incredible seminar this week about multilateralism and the state of multilateralism. And I think it's a conversation that's going on in a lot of different places. And it's very appropriate and timely to have it here at the Palais in Geneva. So my work, as you mentioned, focuses on what I termed the invisible histories of the UN and the Global South. So this idea that we need to depart from having only a Western-based history of the UN and rather look at the other types of histories and views and perspectives of the UN, mostly from Global South actors. And it's termed invisible not because it is not in existence, but because it has not been part of either our mainstream histories of the UN or multilateralism, or indeed mainstream international history in any fundamental way. And so I think that it's an incredibly relevant perspective to take into current debates about multilateralism, because we see a lot of the framing of the moment that we're facing in the international order as one of crisis and one of panic. And where we are in Geneva, and of course in Western Europe in particular, there's a lot of discussion about this crisis of multilateralism being exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also by the Trump presidency in the US. And so a lot of that conversation becomes entangled with issues of European defence and security. And of course, those are relevant for European governments. But I would argue that, firstly, this is a moment that has been coming for a much longer time. And even before the invasion of Ukraine, there was serious consideration to the fact that the institutions that we built to preserve the international system of human rights and the international system of values and a rules-based order that we constructed in 1945 was already under stress. And in fact, if you look at the discourse about multilateralism that comes from the Global South actors, and I include state and non-state actors in that term, then this is a longer conversation that has been going on, which is about opportunity, not about crisis, right? Which is about this moment that finally the system that has been stacked against them structurally is opening, and traditional actors no longer occupy solely traditional roles. And that means that there's space for a greater representation and a greater engagement among Global South actors to actually make more of the system their own. Now, crucially, coming to this problem as a historian, I would argue that this is what they've always sought to do. It's just that we haven't understood the ways in which they've done that, when it has been met with outcomes that were expected, what were the unexpected outcomes, and how did political dynamics change in that process of remaking the system. And that's why I think this perspective is so important in that kind of very noisy chorus about the moment of multilateralism that we're in now.
Yeah, you've really argued against the idea of treating this as a new moment. So tell us a bit more about Global South perspective on multilateralism.
So, of course, Global South actors historically have been in this kind of paradoxical position that always kind of confused me as a scholar, but the one that I found fascinating, which was that there was a great sense of faith in the prospect and the promise represented by institutions of the system, right? International organizations. Even from before the League of Nations, there was a great kind of belief that institutions would serve the broader purpose of equality between states. And we saw this very much reflected in the agency that these actors used at the UN. If we think about an institution that's based here in Geneva, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, well, that was an institution that came from Global South actors in 1964, and so also shaped political dynamics greatly through the Group of 77, which of course also came from that institution. So there have been, very concrete examples of how actors from the Global South actually adapted the UN to their purposes and created lasting changes in the system that shifted politics and policies and programs around specific issues. But the difference between, I suppose, the historical view and the current view is that while that faith may still be there in some sectors, there's also an awful lot of disillusionment, and there's a huge kind of crisis of confidence amongst these actors in, the utility of institutional cooperation through the UN, because, for 82 years now, 81, 82 years, the UN has really not responded in an effective or timely manner to major humanitarian crises in the Global South, never mind actually helped to enable the kind of empowerment of a lot of Global South actors. And so what has happened is that these actors have taken their institution building tendencies outside the system. And that's where you have the growth of all of these institutions like BRICS, like the African Development Bank Group. You have the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. You have lots of other initiatives that tend to be either regionally or trans-regionally based. Now, that in itself isn't a problem, because actually the whole multilateral system requires regional institutions as much as it requires global institutions like the UN. But I think what is a problem is that it's a question of where efforts are directed in a most effective and concrete way. And really at the center of our system of international law and our system of, the very fundamental principles of sovereignty and non-intervention, respect for human rights, the UN is the only global institution that preserves those. And so I think we really need to see also a closer engagement from a lot of these major Global South actors into the UN to really pick up on the historical, what would you say, kind of legacy that they have. And really, this is a moment when they can implement that. And we are still hopeful for that engagement. On some issues, you see it, especially Gaza, but less so on other questions.
Interesting. I've heard you use the word renaissance rather than crisis.
Yeah.
Say more about.
So I suppose I think, the language of crisis is so negative in a lot of respects, and it would seem to imply kind of a panic and a sense of urgency, but also a sense of doom, right? About if you put UN and crisis in the same breath, it doesn't, kind of paint a positive picture. And I think rather if we, try to frame this moment as opportunity, but also think about renaissance, then this is exactly, in fact, where we are. Because there is a debate going on now about UN reform, which is about, do we dissolve the UN entirely, or do we embrace the UN and change it fundamentally? And I think that debate is limited. We can't only think of those two alternatives. And we should really be thinking about renaissance and reform in a very kind of progressive way, rather than only opportunity, because that's in fact, political opportunity is a bit problematic in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, you've said very directly also that the liberal international order has not been liberating for most of the world's population, and that if we keep preserving a system that discriminates, we shouldn't be too surprised that it becomes quite unworkable. So how do you see that as helping us interpret today's fragmentation?
So the first thing to understand, I suppose, is that, and I'm not the first person to say this, and I feel like I say this every time on your podcast, but also many other people say it, which is that the liberal international order has not been liberating for most of the world's population. And of course, that means that they don't have a sense of ownership about preserving what European states particularly declare to be the values that are very important to them. So of course, Global South actors, of course, are interested in kind of the same kind of menu of things that the UN does, economic development, human rights, etc. But I think they would view and would argue that the liberal internationalism has not served them. And that's a very real reality if you consider the kind of, problems of economic development that still are really fundamental. If you consider, the kind of abject poverty that exists in a lot of places, if you consider the desecration of human rights by regimes around the world and, the inability of the UN to kind of respond effectively to that, if you consider also, the ways in which conflict is handled, and again, the effectiveness of peacekeeping in responding to major conflicts. So then obviously, you can argue that liberal internationalism hasn't really delivered that. I suppose the ways in which we see the discourse on this coming out of the Global South is that they talk about multi-alignment as a strategy, right? So that it's not a question of a multipolar world order necessarily in the shape of the kind of 19th century concert diplomacy of spheres of influence. And a lot of commentary right now is asking that question, are we going back to 19th century diplomacy where it's a couple of great powers who, essentially negotiate spaces on the map? I think that's a little naive, because I think if you only talk about great powers, this is not at all the same world that we had in the 19th century and early 20th century. And I mean, major global South states like Brazil and South Africa, but also DRC, Egypt, South Korea, Thailand. These are serious economies. These are, millions and millions of people represented. And they have historically always operated a policy of multi-alignment, that you're not necessarily aligned only to one superpower. And in fact, you try to play a very strategic diplomatic game, political game within the system to try to, just get the best kind of outcome for your country on a particular issue. So I think it's much more realistic what they talk about as multi-alignment being the way forward, rather than a return to 19th century diplomacy and power politics. There will always be power politics in the system, but we're simply not living in this world where the agency of certain states is totally overridden by others on that bigger scale. And so I find that comparison to be a little ahistorical, actually.
Yeah. Thinking more about multilateralism and the way we're talking about it. I mean, network multilateralism has become a key phrase in UN reform discussions, and we've seen it appear a lot, obviously in the Summit of the Future and our Common Agenda. This is really the idea around having an inclusive network system that brings in a wider range of stakeholders, regional organizations, private sector, civil society, and so on. In your view, is this really transformation of multilateralism, or is it really helping reproduce old asymmetries there?
I think that multilateralism by its very nature is always networked, right? I mean, because it's different types of actors. You don't just have states, you have a huge civil society, and you have also institutions, and institutions even within the UN, each of the institutions has its own set of politics, right? So it's always a question of networking issues between various stakeholders. So maybe perhaps networked multilateralism is a very useful term because it unhinges the idea of multilateralism only being driven by states. But I do think that it has, again, of course, I do think that it has a kind of long historical kind of reflection, if you like, in terms of how it came about to that. And I also think that maybe when we're thinking about the value and effectiveness of networks, that's when power politics, again, of course, and asymmetrical politics very much come into the frame. And as we see this multilateral system evolve, whether that's the foreclosing of space to develop new networks, new centres, new institutions, new initiatives, or it's the retooling of the existing systems that we have, which we actually see, I think, a little bit more clearly, then both of those would be different types of networked multilateralism. Just it's a question of where the networks develop, right? Are we going to retool what we have, or are we going to build new networks? And I think neither one is exclusive of the other, really.
So we also talk about minilateralism and microlateralism, and thinking about your work on different blocks, and you've already mentioned some of that, the regionalization within the Global South. What do you see as being new in these minilateral formations, and what feels like a familiar pattern?
I suppose maybe what's new is that a lot of the economic institutions that are being constructed are outside the UN system. I think that's a clear difference, right? So for a long time, the development debate was taking place, at UNCTAD, but also in ECOSOC and in, the third committee where they were thinking about economic rights for a long time. And then you had a kind of a flowering of institutions around those initiatives at the UN during the 1960s and 1970s, because you had the new international economic order. And then that campaign to create a Charter of Rights and Duties for states. And that whole question of how to regulate the activities of corporations that led to the creation of the Office for Transnational Corporate Activity at the UN. So there was a whole flowering of institutions that were inside the UN. And that really came about because Global South actors used their agency and weight in the UN system to create new initiatives and to put lasting changes in the system, institutions, procedures, mechanisms, and all about accountability to kind of further economic development. And now the difference is that energy is not in the system. So what we have on development issues is a much more unregulated neoliberal development sector where firstly the role of corporations is, has always been massive because let's be honest, there's the global corporations of the world are more powerful than most states. But now we live in a totally different environment in terms of their power. And we see that unfettered corporate development is very much a feature of especially the last 10 years, especially since the recovery from the 2008 economic crisis. And then beside that, you have the development of new institutions for economic development that are outside the UN system and that are really with backing from seriously powerful actors. And these institutions, and I'm thinking kind of specifically of development bank groups and institutions that agree to provide capital loans and capital availability for states that are seeking, in fact, sometimes to fulfill debts incurred by the structural adjustment programs of the IMF. That kind of unfettered capital access, which is, it's not directly state sponsored, but it's not within the system of sovereign institutions. That's a difference. And, you can understand the imperative for the creation of these agencies and these groups. And the need that they serve is enormous. And since the UN's capacity is so reduced, this was perhaps inevitable. But that's a differentiation. And I wonder, unless we see a serious fundamental overhaul of not just the IMF and the World Bank, but, maybe also the OECD DAC committee, then really that sector will continue to develop in that direction. And I don't know yet. I mean, you would have to ask a developmental economist about this, but is it going to be kind of a further disaggregation of the UN if more and more of that purpose and that energy is put outside the system, or can it be linked back together? I mean, that is what we remain to see.
Very interesting. If coming back to the UN, you've talked much about how Global South actors have shaped UN structures and working methods, norms, procedures and so on. Do you think that this sort of shaping using the institutional and procedural means within the system will continue? Or do you think there's really going to be more agreement or search for agreement around globally shared values?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we did discuss this at the conference the other day, and I think it's a really good one. What do global values mean now? And what global values are we thinking about preserving? Yeah, it's a very difficult question to ask. I mean, the one thing I would say, historically again, is that the thing that really, the whole solidarity of Global South cooperation was based around this idea of being united in achieving equality between states, right? In actually, it was not just about overcoming the North-South divide, and I don't think it was just about anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism, especially after the 1960s, but it was much more about equality, right? Gaining an equal foothold in the system and having equal access to resources, not just capital resources, but all kinds of other things. And I do think that sense of solidarity is rather waning as South-South groups become more asymmetrical. And because now you have major, major, major powers within the global south. And then sometimes China is also in that group and sometimes it's not, right? So the kind of sense of solidarity that was perhaps transformative in thinking about the values of the world is lagging behind what it was before. Whereas European states are clinging on to that idea, well, we're still for liberal values, we're for a rules-based order, and we're for human rights. But nobody knows anymore what that means if the institutions that we built to preserve those values are totally dysfunctional. And, we put the UN in that bracket, unfortunately. So the conversation on values, I think, should really kind of be tethered to not so much the values themselves, but I think we can all agree on the kind of centrality of the values of sovereignty, non-intervention and protection of human rights. I don't think there's any disagreement there. I think it's much more about how do we implement or create or revise or reform a system that will really protect those values. And the key issue in that is legitimacy, especially for Global South actors who want greater representation and who want equal representation in a new system, but also accountability. How do you hold major states accountable? And we're living in a time when the global powers, plural, show blatant contempt and flagrant violation for sovereignty, right? And that's a very difficult conversation then. So the values question, we can think roughly agree, but how do we protect those values is the major sticking point.
Yes, interesting work ahead. So, thinking about that also, we're going into this new selection cycle for the next UN Secretary General. Given all the invisible histories and so on, what kind of leadership profile do you think the organization needs now, and to do that sort of work that you were just talking about?
Well, obviously you need a visionary and you need somebody to lead the UN who actually has an understanding of these kind of longer views of what the organization is, and who comes at this from a perspective perhaps of having, close familiarity with some of those crises, and also a very good network that can be utilized to strengthen the UN. And I think also what is perhaps necessarily required is an individual, and preferably a woman. I mean, it's, long overdue that we should have a woman Secretary General of the UN, but somebody who really understands the North-South relationship in different ways, right? Rather than this idea that because a lot of the debate now in geopolitics is about spheres of influence and global powers, but rather somebody who sees this on the other side of that equation. And I think that there are more than one candidate in the race currently who would understand that in a very fundamental way. Now, why is that important? Because remember that something like the BRICS group represents almost 40% of the world's population, and that population has not been served by the UN. So you need somebody who has a radically different perspective on the meaning of the UN and global order and its purposes for people who have not viewed it in the way that it has been traditionally understood in the West, but also somebody who can go beyond that and say, look, now we can actually, embrace this opportunity to shape the UN more effectively towards the future. And to do that takes mobilization of political capital as much as financial capital. And so we need somebody well placed with that as well, I think.
Over the decades, member states have incrementally reformed the selection process. From a historian's perspective, how do you think that existing procedures can be maximized?
I think they need to be much more transparent. I think there's a great sense of the intransparency of the selection procedure. Everybody knows that it's a political horse trading game, and oftentimes you have candidates who are outside individuals who are maybe not the favourites in the race who actually end up winning it. And I think this is kind of reflective of some of the worst features of the UN and the kind of the intransparency of politics in the corridors. Everybody knows the UN and every international organisation works like that. But the selection of the Secretary General is so important that I think it should be much, much more transparent. I think the public campaigns should be broader, because the mandate of the next SG has to address the public disillusionment with the organization, the public frustration. And it's not just, disillusionment of people who feel like that the UN is not relevant to their lives directly, but it's also the disillusionment of people, who live in UN refugee camps, who say that UN is not doing enough, and, who really then become frustrated with the idea that this should matter to them. And so I think somebody who's able to re-enchant the public imagination with the value of the UN is what is required. And on the other hand, the people who are individual states who are selecting the Secretary General should look for somebody who's able to do that, because you can get a great politician, you can make a deal between the P5 about who that might be. But if that person doesn't have any public, not necessarily recognition, but public traction, then, they're going to face exactly the same kind of problems. And so I think that should definitely be a consideration.
At the same time, I've heard you push back against the idea that the UN is unfit for purpose, and said really we should look at what we allow and enable the institution to do, and how we fund it, and how we narrate its history. So bringing out again these invisible histories. So looking ahead, what would a UN look like that's really taking these invisible histories seriously and use them as a resource to renew that multilateralism?
Well, thanks for the vote of confidence in the work that may actually be able to change anything. I think most historians don't expect anything like that. But I think, the phrase that the UN is not fit for purpose is just so flat and basically a kind of superficial criticism, because the UN isn't just one system. It has so many different purposes, there's so many different organs, and there's so many different levels and dimensions of activity, right? So firstly, the system itself is dysfunctional, is a more accurate way to put it. But the UN is, we have to remember, only what we enable it to do. It's only what the resources that states give it to be able to do its job. I mean, peacekeeping is such a good example of that, because the limited budget that peacekeeping has is, only a tiny percentage of global arms expenditure every year. And I can imagine that for 2025 and 2026, those percentages will get even smaller, given the increase in military and defense spending around the world at the moment. So I think we need to start at the root. And most recently, Mary Robinson, the former Irish president, has called for closer engagement of states like Ireland with the Article 109 campaign. And that campaign is about revising the UN Charter, holding a Charter review conference as is mandated by Article 109 of the Charter. And so that's something that the founders envisioned. They never intended the UN to be exactly the same in 2026 as it was in 1945. So they built in a provision under Article 109 for a review and reform of the Charter where necessary. Now, the first kind of tenet of that Charter to hold a review conference requires a 2/3 majority from the General Assembly. So it's a possibility that a review conference could take place. The second stage is much more difficult, because any outcomes from a Charter review conference have to be agreed by the P5. So that part we know is more difficult. But I think it's a very good starting point to say, look, let's take the Charter as a holistic document and think about a different kind of organisation that could be built from within by revising not the fundamental principles, but the operative systems that are described and mandated within that Charter. And that requires engagement from states who are hesitant to open the Charter, as it has been referred to, because they are afraid of losing position within the UN. On the other hand, there are states for whom the Charter, really is a living document that they actually use quite a lot. I mean, we see that especially if you think about how the statesmen and women have used provisions under the Charter to try to make the UN more effective in places like Gaza or Ukraine in recent years. And then on the other hand, you have a group of states who show blatant contempt for the Charter. So it's not an easy prospect, but no part of world making or order making is easy. And I think that would be a really good way forward. And I think with that view and with an understanding that the UN is not a kind of a mechanism or a vehicle for liberal internationalism, but that actually it can represent many different world orders and worldviews, and that it has done historically, I think that would be a good starting point for thinking about the future of the UN.
That does sound like a good starting point. Can we come back to people, the general public? You talked about the engagement that a new Secretary General needs to have with the world's population and why it matters to them. So when you work with students and local communities around the universities that you've been involved with, how do you explain why this struggle over the future of the UN should matter to them?
Yeah, it's a good question. And part of my job has been to communicate the UN's kind of relevance in clear ways. And for a while, I was working specifically on a project about that with students who were from what would be traditionally socioeconomically disadvantaged communities in and around The Hague. And it was a really rewarding and rich project because, I came at it thinking that, I will talk about the UN to the students and maybe there'll be something interesting in it for them. But actually what I learned was that many of them had come through the UN system themselves as refugees and had both very positive associations with the UN, but also, great frustrations with the UN not being able to do more for them and their families when they were coming from more torn regions, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. So it was a very, very, very enriching experience, which actually showed me that the relevance of the UN isn't just about thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals and their importance. I mean, this is important and everybody can agree on the SDGs is something we should achieve. But it also comes down to individual human experiences of and interactions with international organizations and different aspects of the UN. And it's a difficult conversation because, you deal with a lot of kind of frustration, but also a lot of despair, right? I mean, where is the UN? Why are they not doing more? Why are they not intervening? Why are they not saving humanity? And the answers to that are sometimes simple, sometimes complicated. But I think ultimately the humanitarian impulse is really interesting, right? And so actually it didn't really take that much interaction with either the students at the university that I teach or, this group that I worked with to get them to think about the UN. I mean, they knew what the UN was, and we had a really kind of rich and lively set of discussions about what it could be, because that humanitarian impulse exists I think most people in the world share that. And that's what's so interesting about discussion of making the UN relevant, is that, you can connect with what people already think is important. Mm-hmm. And so the UN's relevance is very direct if you just put it in the right framework. Mm-hmm. And then you get away from these kind of tired discussions about Security Council, because that's only what occupies public imagination in some ways. But actually, the more fundamental issues are actually, I think, what most people prefer to talk about when they're thinking about the UN's role.
And their own agency.
Yeah, and their own agency. And, we got to this point where we thought, well, we're all part of the UN, and this is what we should be thinking about becoming involved in. And I'm really delighted that, I've been teaching now for 12 years, and I really am so proud that some students went off and joined the UN and joined other institutions, that are thinking about these questions. And that, to me, that's a terrifically good sign from this generation.
It's heartwarming. So with this, to close, what point from around your work on invisible histories would you like us to hold in mind for this multilateralism for the future?
So I'll try to be succinct. I guess what's important from the invisible histories is to understand that the UN is not what we think it is, as something that has only preserved an American worldview for the last 80 years. But it has been the vehicle and the impulse for humanity's dreams of a better future. And although we haven't yet achieved it, I think we've made gains along the way.
Wonderful. Alanna, thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks a million. Thanks.